The ribbons in their hair were perfectly tied. Soviet soldiers entering Hitler's bunker on May 3, 1945, found 6 children lying in their beds in the Vor bunker, dressed in white nightgowns, their faces peaceful, as if sleeping. 12-year-old Helga's dark hair was arranged with care. 11-year-old Hilde lay next to her. 9-year-old Helmut, the only boy, still wore the dental braces his father had joked about. 7-year-old Holde was arranged beside 6-year-old Hedda. 4-year-old Heide, the youngest, clutched a stuffed animal. They looked like children tucked into bed by loving parents. But these children were dead, poisoned with cyanide on May 1, 1945, murdered by their own mother 2 days before Soviet forces would discover their bodies. They were the 6 children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels, Nazi Germany's propaganda minister and his fanatically loyal wife. Their deaths in Hitler's bunker represented the final, most intimate crime of the Nazi regime. Parents who chose to murder their own children rather than allow them to live in a world without Adolf Hitler. These were not casualties of war or collateral damage. They were deliberate murders, children killed by ideology, victims of parents who loved Hitler more than their own flesh and blood. Their story reveals the ultimate corruption of the Nazi regime, where devotion to the Führer superseded even the most fundamental human bonds, where mothers became murderers and fathers stood by as their children died. 6 innocent lives ended in a concrete tomb beneath Berlin, the last victims of Hitler's Germany. The Goebbels children had been born into privilege and propaganda. Helga Susanna arrived on September 1, 1932, the first child of Joseph and Magda Goebbels' marriage. Joseph, already rising through Nazi party ranks, was appointed propaganda minister in 1933 when Helga was barely a year old. She grew up in the spotlight of Nazi Germany, photographed with Hitler, featured in newsreels as the ideal German child. On Hitler's birthday, April 20, 1936, 4-year-old Helga presented flowers to the Führer alongside her sister Hilde, the image captured for propaganda purposes. Hitler adored the Goebbels children, particularly Helga, and visited them frequently at the family's villa. Joseph wrote in his diary that Helga was his favorite, his daddy's girl, who would run to him the moment he returned from his office. Hildegard Traudel, called Hilde, was born April 13, 1934. Joseph described her in his diary as a little mouse, quieter than her older sister, but equally cherished. Helmut Christian, the only son, arrived October 2, 1935. Joseph called him a clown and worried about his academic performance, though Helmut responded well to tutoring from Magda and achieved good grades despite his father's initial concerns. Holdine Catherine, called Holde, was born February 19, 1937. Legend says the doctor delivering her exclaimed, "Das ist ein Holde," which means, "That's a pretty one," and the name stuck. Hedwig Johanna, called Hedda, came May 5, 1938. By 1944, 6-year-old Hedda had developed a crush on SS Adjutant Günther Schwagermann, insisting she would marry him when she grew up, captivated by the fact that he had a glass eye. Heidrun Elizabeth, called Heide, was born May 20, 1940, sharing her father's birthday. She was called the Reconciliation Child because she was conceived after Joseph and Magda had nearly divorced over Joseph's affair with Czech actress Lida Barova. The children lived in extraordinary luxury for wartime Germany. The family owned a villa on Schwanenwerde, an exclusive island in Berlin's Wannsee district, and a lakeside house at Lanka, where the children spent summers swimming and sailing. They had governesses, tutors, and access to resources ordinary German children couldn't imagine. But their privileged existence came with constant public exposure. Joseph Goebbels used his own family for propaganda, presenting them as the model German family, proof that Nazi ideology created happy, healthy children. Newsreels showed the Goebbels children playing, laughing, greeting their father. Photographs appeared in magazines throughout the Reich. These children were symbols of Nazi Germany's future, carefully curated images of Aryan perfection. But the children's actual childhood was far from the propaganda image. Joseph was a serial philanderer who conducted numerous affairs while remaining married to Magda. His relationship with actress Lida Barova became so public that Magda asked Hitler to grant her a divorce in 1938. Hitler refused, ordering Joseph to end the affair and preserve his marriage for the sake of Nazi family values propaganda. Magda complied, conceiving Heide as proof of reconciliation, but the marriage remained troubled. The children grew up witnessing their parents' conflicts, their father's frequent absences, their mother's unhappiness masked by public devotion to Nazi ideals. As the war turned against Germany, the Goebbels family's privileged isolation ended. Allied bombing raids on Berlin intensified throughout 1944 and early 1945. The family evacuated repeatedly to their country homes, but by April 1945, Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin from the east, while Western allies approached from the west. Germany's defeat was inevitable. Hitler had retreated to the Führer bunker, an underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. On April 22, 1945, Hitler suffered what witnesses described as a complete breakdown, admitting for the first time that Germany would lose the war. He transferred most bunker staff to Berchtesgaden in southern Germany, allowing them to escape the approaching Soviet forces. But Joseph and Magda Goebbels made a different choice.
On April 22, Magda brought all 6 children to the bunker. They moved into the Vor bunker, the upper level of the underground complex, where they shared a single room with bunk beds. The children ranged in age from 4 to 12, Heide barely more than a toddler, Helga on the cusp of adolescence. They had no understanding of the political or military situation. They knew Berlin was being bombed, that Soviet soldiers were coming, that adults around them were frightened and tense. But they were children, and children adapt. Bunker residents later testified that the Goebbels children seemed remarkably cheerful given the circumstances. Erna Flegel, a nurse working in the bunker's makeshift hospital, described them as charming and absolutely delightful. They played with Hitler's dog, Blondie, and her puppies. They sang songs. They were, by all accounts, normal children trying to maintain normalcy in abnormal circumstances. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, spent time with the children in the days before Hitler's death. She remembered them as sweet and innocent, unaware that their parents had already decided they would not leave the bunker alive. On April 30, 1945, Junge was with the children when they heard the gunshot that signaled Hitler's suicide. The sound was loud in the confined concrete space. The children asked what had happened. The adults told them it had been a bomb, distant shelling. The children accepted this explanation and continued playing. They had no way of knowing that Hitler, the man their parents worshipped, the Uncle Führer, who had given them candy and patted their heads, had just shot himself in the next room. After Hitler's death, the remaining bunker occupants faced desperate choices. Most chose to attempt escape, trying to break through Soviet lines and reach Western Allied forces. Several people, including Red Cross leader Karl Gebhardt and architect Albert Speer, offered to take the Goebbels children out of Berlin. There were plans to smuggle them west to areas controlled by American or British forces. The children could have been saved, but Magda Goebbels refused every offer. She had made her decision weeks earlier. In conversations with others, she had explained her reasoning. She did not want her children to grow up hearing that their father had been one of the century's foremost criminals. She believed reincarnation might grant them a better future life. The world after the Führer and National Socialism was not worth living in. Her children were too good for that world. A merciful God would understand when she gave them salvation. These were not the words of a protective mother. They were the justifications of a fanatical ideologue who had so thoroughly internalized Nazi ideology that she could frame murdering her children as an act of love. Magda had spent years as the unofficial First Lady of Nazi Germany, Hitler's closest female confidant, a true believer who had embraced every aspect of Nazi doctrine. Her devotion to Hitler exceeded her maternal instincts. Her commitment to Nazi ideology was stronger than her love for her own children. And on May 1st, 1945, she acted on that devotion. The details of how the children died remain partially uncertain based on conflicting testimonies from bunker survivors. What is clear is that Magda enlisted help from SS doctors in the bunker. Dr. Helmut Kuntz, a dentist serving as a medical officer, later testified that Magda asked him to help kill the children. He initially refused, saying he was incapable of such an act. Magda then told him it was Hitler's order, though Hitler was already dead. Whether this was true or a lie to compel cooperation remains unknown. Kuntz agreed to sedate the children with morphine injections. He testified that he injected the children but did not administer the fatal cyanide. Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician and SS officer, appears to have administered the poison. Multiple witnesses, including Rokas Misch, the bunker's telephone operator, stated that Werner Neumann told him he had seen Stumpfegger give the children something sweetened to drink. Other accounts suggest the cyanide was given in the form of chocolate or candy. Nurse Erna Flegel later recalled Magda telling the children they needed medicine because they would be staying in the bunker for a long time. The children, trusting their mother, accepted the morphine injections and the sweetened poison without resistance. The timeline that followed was documented by multiple witnesses. After the children had been sedated and poisoned, Magda returned to the Führer bunker, the lower level where Hitler had died. Rokas Misch, working at the telephone switchboard, tried to concentrate on his duties, but he knew what had happened. Magda's appearance told the story. She was pale, her eyes red from crying, her face frozen in the expression of shock and grief. She sat down at a table and began playing patience, solitaire, mechanically moving cards while her mind processed what she had done. Joseph Goebbels approached her but said nothing. What was there to say? Their children were dead by their own hands. Approximately 2 hours after poisoning their children, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up the concrete stairs from the Führer bunker to the Reichschancellery garden. It was around 8:30 p.m. on May 1, 1945. Multiple witnesses saw them leave but were instructed not to follow. Accounts of their deaths vary. Some testimonies suggest they each bit cyanide capsules and were then shot by SS adjutant Günther Schwagermann as a coup de grâce to ensure death. Other accounts claim Schwagermann shot them at the request without cyanide. What is certain is that within minutes, both were dead in the garden above the bunker, their bodies partially burned with petrol, but not fully cremated. Unlike Hitler and Eva Braun, whose bodies had been thoroughly burned, the Goebbels remains were recognizable when Soviet troops found them.
On May 2, 1945, Soviet forces entered the Reich Chancellery and began exploring the bunker complex. They found Johannes Henschel, the bunker's master electrician, who had remained behind to maintain power for the field hospital above. He surrendered immediately and began guiding Soviet officers through the complex. On May 3rd, Soviet troops led by Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Klemenko discovered the bodies of the 6 Goebbels children in the Vor bunker. The scene was exactly as Magda had arranged it. The children lying in their beds, dressed in white nightgowns, ribbons tied in the girls' hair. They looked like they were sleeping peacefully. The clear mark of cyanide poisoning, a bluish discoloration, was visible on their faces, but otherwise they appeared undamaged. There was no blood, no violence, no signs of struggle. The children had been murdered while unconscious, never knowing their mother had poisoned them. Vice Admiral Hans Voss and Hans Fritsch, a German radio commentator, were brought to identify the bodies. Both confirmed the children's identities. The bodies were removed from the bunker and taken to Buch Cemetery in Berlin for autopsy. Soviet doctors confirmed cyanide poisoning as the cause of death. Photographs were taken for documentation. Then began an extraordinary saga of burial and exhumation that would last for decades. The remains of Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their 6 children, General Hans Krebs, and Hitler's dogs were buried together, then repeatedly dug up and moved as Soviet authorities tried to prevent the sites from becoming Nazi shrines. In February 1946, all the remains were interred at an SMERSH facility in Magdeburg, East Germany. They stayed there for 24 years. In 1970, KGB Director Yuri Andropov authorized final disposal of the remains. On April 4, 1970, a Soviet KGB team used detailed burial charts to exhume 5 wooden boxes containing the bodies. The remains were burned, crushed to powder, and scattered into the Biederitz River, a tributary of the Elbe. The Goebbels children literally ceased to exist, their remains dispersed into water, leaving no grave, no memorial, no physical trace of their existence beyond photographs and testimonies. The world's reaction to the murders was complex and remains so today. The children were undeniably innocent. They had not chosen their parents or participated in Nazi crimes. They were victims as surely as any child killed during the war. But they were also the children of Joseph Goebbels, one of history's most evil men, architect of Nazi propaganda, complicit in genocide. This created moral ambiguity that persists decades later. In 2005, Rokas Mish, who had been the last person to see the children alive and regretted not intervening, called for a memorial plaque to honor the 6 Goebbels children. The proposal triggered immediate controversy. Critics argued that honoring Goebbels' children would taint the memory of Holocaust victims. How could Germany commemorate the children of a man who had helped engineer the murder of millions of children? Mish's argument was simple but powerful. The children themselves were completely innocent. They had no choice about who they were biologically related to. They were murdered, just as other victims during the war were murdered. To treat them as criminals like their parents was wrong. They deserved to be remembered as the innocent victims they were. The debate revealed unresolved questions about guilt, innocence, and memory. Can we separate children from their parents' crimes? Should we? The Goebbels children's names, Helga, Hilde, Helmut, Holde, Hedda, Heide, appear in no memorials. Their existence is acknowledged in historical accounts, but not commemorated. They remain the forgotten victims, children whose innocence is overshadowed by their surname. One person who survived the Goebbels family was Harald Quandt, Magda's son from her first marriage to industrialist Günther Quandt. Harald, born in 1921, was 23 when his half-siblings were murdered. He was serving in the Luftwaffe and had been captured by Allied forces, becoming a prisoner of war. This accident of military service saved his life. After the war, Harald refused to discuss his mother's actions publicly. He became a successful industrialist, inheriting and expanding his biological father's business empire. He died in a plane crash in 1967, taking to his grave whatever private thoughts he had about his mother murdering his half-siblings. His own children, Magda Goebbels' grandchildren, have also remained largely silent about their family history. 15-year-old Johanna Ruf, a member of the Federation of German Girls, who worked as a nurse in the bunker during its final days, was one of the last witnesses to the children's lives. On April 30, 1945, young Helmut Goebbels was rude to her while she tended wounded soldiers. Ruf, frustrated and exhausted, slapped him. She didn't know the boy was Joseph Goebbels' son until later and worried she would be punished for striking the propaganda minister's child. But within hours, Hitler was dead, and by the next day, Helmut and his sisters were dead too. Ruf survived the bunker's fall and lived until 2023, dying at age 94. In her final decades, she published memoirs titled A Slap for the Goebbels Kid, describing her experiences in the bunker and her brief interaction with children who would be dead within 24 hours.
Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary who spent time with the children in their final days, carried guilt about not saving them for the rest of her life. In post-war interviews, she described the children as innocent and sweet, completely unaware of what their parents had planned. Helga expressed deep regret that she and others in the bunker had not defied Magda's wishes and smuggled the children out. But the bunker's atmosphere in those final days was one of fatalism and obedience. Hitler's authority, even after his death, remained absolute. Magda Goebbels was the Führer's most loyal follower. Who would dare contradict her wishes? Who would risk attempting to save children whose mother had decided they should die? The murders of the Goebbels children represent the ultimate perversion of maternal instinct transformed by ideology. Throughout history, mothers have sacrificed themselves to save their children from danger. They have hidden children from enemies, gone hungry so their children could eat, died protecting their offspring. Maternal love is considered one of the most powerful and fundamental human emotions. Yet Magda Goebbels inverted this instinct completely. She killed her children to protect them, not from physical danger, but from a world where Nazi socialism had failed, where Hitler was dead, where her children might learn that everything their parents believed was evil. Her maternal love manifested as murder, a twisted logic where death was preferable to life without the Führer. Joseph Goebbels' complicity was equally monstrous. He did not personally poison his children. Magda and the SS doctors did that. But he approved and facilitated their deaths. In Hitler's bunker on April 29th, Joseph added a postscript to Hitler's last will and testament. He wrote that he would disobey Hitler's order to leave Berlin and would die in the bunker. He stated that Magda and their children supported this decision. He then qualified this absurd claim by noting that the children would support it if they were old enough to speak for themselves. This was a man telling the world that his children would choose death if they could, using his children's hypothetical consent to justify murdering them. It was gaslighting on a historical scale, using propaganda techniques to rationalize infanticide. The Goebbels children's deaths must be understood in the broader context of how Nazi ideology corrupted every human relationship. The regime that created elaborate rituals celebrating motherhood and family also demanded that loyalty to the Führer supersede all other bonds. Hitler himself never married until his final day, presenting himself as a man married to Germany, sacrificing personal happiness for national duty. This model of absolute devotion extended to his followers. Parents were expected to be willing to sacrifice their children for the Reich. Children were taught to report parents who expressed doubts about Nazism. Family bonds were subordinate to ideological purity. The Goebbels murders represented the logical conclusion of this ideology, parents killing children rather than allowing them to live in a world where Nazi socialism had failed, where Nazism had been discredited. The children's deaths also revealed the bankruptcy of Nazi racial ideology. Joseph and Magda Goebbels had spent years promoting Nazi doctrines about Aryan superiority, about the importance of healthy German children for the Reich's future, about the sacred duty of motherhood. Magda had been held up as the model German mother, the woman who had given 6 perfect Aryan children to the fatherland. Yet when the ideology failed, when the promised 1,000-year Reich collapsed after 12 years, these same parents murdered the children they had presented as symbols of Nazi perfection. The propaganda was revealed as hollow. The ideology was exposed as death worship. The children who had represented the future were sacrificed to preserve the past. If we must find any redemption in this story, it exists in the voices of those like Rokas Mish, who insisted the children were innocent and deserved to be remembered as victims rather than forgotten as embarrassments. It exists in historical documentation that preserves the children's names and faces, preventing them from being erased from memory entirely. And it exists in the universal revulsion the murders provoke, the recognition that killing one's own children represents an absolute moral boundary that no ideology can justify crossing. The Goebbels children were prisoners of their parents' fanaticism.
victims of an ideology that valued abstract ideas more than human lives. They were Hitler's last victims not because he killed them directly, but because his ideology provided the framework that allowed their parents to murder them without apparent remorse. On May 1, 1945, in a concrete bunker beneath a destroyed city, 6 children died because their mother loved Adolf Hitler more than she loved them. That is the final unforgivable crime of the Nazi regime, written in the small bodies of 6 innocent children whose ribbons were carefully tied, even in death.